Part 1. What did royal doctors actually do? Hey everyone, welcome back to the Bedside Chronicles. Tonight, we're drifting softly back into the drafty chambers and perfumed corridors of royal palaces. The kind where everything looks perfect until you realize someone is quietly bleeding under all that brocade. So, settle in. Dim the lights. Let the day dissolve behind you. And let's take a slow, sleepy wander through the world of royal doctors. Those noble, trembling figures who stood between kings and death, and often failed at both, because royal medicine, for most of history, was less about healing and more about appearances. It was theater, elaborate, fragrant, and occasionally fatal theater. Let's start with a thought. Imagine being a doctor in the 14th century. No microscopes, no anesthesia, and the firm belief that sneezing too hard might dislodge your soul. Now imagine your patient is a king. He has absolute power. He's in constant pain. And if you don't fix him quickly, he might have you executed for incompetence. That's the royal physician's daily routine. They lived in a delicate balance between medical guesswork and political survival, because healing a monarch wasn't really about science. It was about confidence. You had to sound convincing while recommending something completely ridiculous, like powdered emeralds or pigeon baths. The guiding principle of most medieval medicine was the humoral theory, the idea that your body contained four sacred fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was all about keeping them in balance. Too much blood? You'd be too hot and passionate. Too much phlegm? You'd be sluggish and melancholy. Too much black bile? Depressed. Too much yellow bile? Angry and impulsive. You might notice. None of this makes sense, but it explained everything to them. From illness to personality to moral character. And unfortunately for royal patients, most doctors had only one solution to everything. Let's get that blood out of you. Royal medicine was deeply concerned with appearances. A healthy-looking king meant a stable kingdom. So, physicians often exaggerated success and underplayed disaster. If the monarch looked pale and weak, they'd say, "Ah, yes, a perfect complexion of noble balance." If he was sweating through his sheets, they'd whisper, "The body purges impurities, as ordained by nature." Meanwhile, the king was probably dying of dysentery. Take Charles II of England, for instance. The merry monarch. He wasn't particularly merry at the end. When he fell ill in 1685, his team of royal doctors gathered like anxious seagulls around a dying fish. They tried everything. They bled him repeatedly. They forced him to drink potions made of crushed pearls, burned bones, and something called unicorn horn, which, tragically, was just narwhal tusk. They even applied pigeon parts to his feet to draw out the illness. After a week of this medical torture, Charles died, probably from the treatment, not the disease. His doctors, however, declared that they had done everything in accordance with the highest art, which was technically true. If you define art as creative ways to kill a man slowly, royal physicians weren't chosen for skill. They were chosen for loyalty and flattery. Kings wanted someone who would reassure them that their headaches were signs of divine stress, not bad wine or gout. It was a performance. Doctors had to bow, flatter, and deliver prescriptions with the gravity of a priest reading scripture, and many of them were half-priests. Religion and medicine were closely tied. You might treat the king's fever with both leeches and prayer, preferably in Latin. If the fever got worse, you just increased both. Of course, not all royal physicians were quacks. Some were brilliant, by the standards of their time, at least. Take Ambroise Père, a French surgeon who served several kings in the 16th century. He was the first to reject boiling oil as a treatment for gunshot wounds, which, believe it or not, was the standard method. Before Père, surgeons literally poured boiling oil into open wounds to cleanse them. One night, Père ran out of oil. In a mild panic, he used a gentle herbal balm instead. The next morning, he expected to find his patients dead. Instead, they were resting comfortably. Meanwhile, the ones treated with oil were screaming. Père quietly wrote in his journal, "I dressed him, and God healed him." A rare case of modesty in a profession that often confused luck for divine brilliance. But not every royal doctor was so lucky. For every Père, there was a Dr. Hall, Dr. Collier, or Dr. Van Helmont, busily murdering their monarchs with confidence and charm. Take King Henry VIII, a man whose diet could best be described as aggressively meaty. By his 40s, he was obese, ulcerated, and perpetually angry. His doctors called it a fullness of the humors. The treatment: more bleeding, more purging, more poultices. They also applied herbs and oils directly into his open wounds, which only made them worse. But no one dared suggest that His Majesty stopped eating entire swans, or that his mysterious swelling might be from lack of movement and too much wine. Instead, they called him robust. He died robustly at age 55. Royal physicians were expected to know not just medicine, but etiquette. They had to speak softly, flatter endlessly, and never contradict a royal opinion. If the king said he felt much better after a session of leeching, you agreed, even if he looked like an empty wineskin, because contradicting a monarch could be fatal in more ways than one. And some rulers were deeply suspicious of their doctors. After all, poison and medicine looked suspiciously similar in the 16th century. Both came in small bottles. Both were administered by trusted hands. So when a king died suddenly, the doctor was often the first to be questioned, sometimes tortured, sometimes executed, which, admittedly, did not make the job more relaxing. One particularly unfortunate example is King Charles IX of France, a nervous young man who ruled during the French Wars of Religion. He suffered from nosebleeds, fainting spells, and what we now call severe anxiety. His doctors prescribed bleeding and purging, which naturally made him weaker. When he died at 23, vomiting blood, rumors spread that his physicians had poisoned him. In truth, they'd just followed their training. The human body can only lose so much blood before it stops cooperating. But while many royal physicians were little more than courtly decorators with scalpels, the profession slowly improved, painfully, reluctantly. By the 17th century, the rise of anatomy and experimentation began to challenge superstition. Doctors started opening up bodies, mostly criminals, occasionally unlucky peasants, to study how things actually worked, and it horrified everyone. Autopsies were considered indecent, even blasphemous, but knowledge crept forward, inch by inch, under candlelight. Of course, royal doctors still had to pretend to believe in the old ways. They'd perform a little ritual bleeding for show, then sneak off to try the new scientific remedies they didn't dare discuss openly. Let's drift for a moment to Russia, where things were somehow even worse. Tsar Ivan the Terrible had several personal physicians, all of whom lived in constant fear of his moods. One day, he might shower them with gold. The next, he might throw them in the river for malpractice. His final doctor, a Scotsman named Eliseus Bomelius, was an astrologer physician, meaning he treated illness by consulting the stars. When the Tsar's headaches persisted, Bomelius blamed the alignment of Jupiter. Ivan, unimpressed, had him tortured to death, a reminder that celestial medicine was sometimes a high-risk profession. By the 18th century, medicine was modernizing, at least superficially. Royal doctors began wearing powdered wigs, carrying silver instruments, and speaking of electrical tonics and vital airs. They loved big words. They made you sound intelligent while still being completely wrong. One famous royal doctor, Dr. John Arbuthnot, served Queen Anne of England. He was witty, educated, and charming, everything a monarch could want in a dinner companion who occasionally prescribed enemas. When Queen Anne fell ill from gout and obesity, Arbuthnot kept her comfortable with mild opiates and polite conversation. He knew she wouldn't recover, but at least she could drift into a morphine-assisted peace, in a way that might have been the most merciful royal treatment of all. And then there's the strange overlap between royal medicine and alchemy, because of course there was. For centuries, kings and queens funded alchemists, those mystical scientists who promised eternal youth, universal cures, and gold from lead. Most of them were charlatans, but they knew how to appeal to royal vanity. They'd whisper, "Your Majesty's blood is special. It must be refined like gold." And suddenly, the monarch would hand them a laboratory and a lifetime pension. The most famous example? Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. He desperately wanted to live forever, so his doctors, or alchemists, really gave him pills made from powdered jade and mercury. He took them daily. They were supposed to grant immortality. Instead, they poisoned him slowly until he died at 49, forever immortalized as the man who overdosed on liquid metal. The irony is almost poetic. Let's pause here and take a breath. Imagine the quiet of those royal chambers, the rustle of silk curtains, the slow drip of candle wax. A king lies sweating, pale, surrounded by anxious doctors who don't really know what they're doing. They whisper in Latin, pass bottles of strange mixtures, and pretend that this is medicine. The truth is, royal doctors were never just healers. They were actors, priests, politicians, and sometimes scapegoats. Their patients were divine, their knowledge was fragile, and their job was impossible. And yet, somehow, from all that superstition and fear, real medicine emerged. Not quickly, not gracefully, but piece by piece, through centuries of failure and the occasional spark of truth. Because sometimes, even a royal mistake leaves behind a little bit of wisdom. End of part 1. Part 2. The strange remedies of royal doctors. Hey everyone, if you're still awake, well done. You've survived the leeching, the purging, and the pigeon-foot poultices of part 1. Tonight, we're drifting even deeper into the gentle absurdity of royal medicine. The side filled with potions, powders, and more than a few ingredients you really don't want to think about right before bed. Because while royal doctors claim to practice the noble art of healing, they also had a strange habit of collecting ingredients from, well, everything. Animal organs, gemstones, mold, human remains. If it existed, they probably boiled it, ground it, or smeared it on someone important. So let's take a calm little walk through the apothecaries and royal sick rooms of centuries past. A place where mercury was medicine, mummies were nutritional supplements, and doctors carried vials of powdered skulls in their pockets, just in case. Let's start with one of the royal doctor's favorite tools, mercury. Yes, that shiny liquid metal that's now known to cause horrific neurological damage. Back then, it was the wonder drug of kings. To them, mercury looked like health. It was bright, fluid, reflective, alive, almost. They called it quicksilver, and they believed it could restore balance to the body, especially when the illness was considered stubborn. One of its main uses was in treating syphilis, a royal favorite, because when you've got entire dynasties marrying their cousins, diseases tend to circulate as freely as titles. Mercury was rubbed onto the skin, ingested, or even vaporized and inhaled. The effects were, shall we say, dramatic. Patients drooled uncontrollably, lost teeth, and sometimes went mad. But if they survived the treatment, which many did not, the rash might temporarily fade, and that, to a 16th century royal doctor, counted as success. In fact, a common saying at the time went, "A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury," which, honestly, might be the most unintentionally accurate medical slogan ever written. Another royal favorite was Mamiya, or, to put it bluntly, ground up human corpses. This one deserves a moment of quiet reflection. For centuries, European doctors imported mummies from Egypt, believing their preserved flesh contained mystical healing powers. They ground them into powders, mixed them with wine, and prescribed them for everything from nosebleeds to headaches. And the most expensive, most sought after form of mumia came from royal tombs. Because if you're a king, obviously you deserve the powdered remains of another king. Even more charmingly, many apothecaries ran out of Egyptian mummies pretty quickly, so they improvised, robbing local graves and drying out criminals instead. Royal physicians either didn't notice or pretended not to, because you can't tell the Queen of France she's been drinking powdered thief all month. Speaking of delightful ingredients, let's move on to bezoars. These were small, stony masses found in the stomachs of goats and other animals, formed from undigested material. They were incredibly rare, and that made them irresistible to monarchs. Bezoars were believed to neutralize any poison. If someone tried to assassinate you with a tainted cup of wine, a tiny pinch of bezoar powder could, allegedly, save your life. King Charles IX of France, the anxious one we mentioned earlier, kept one near him at all times. He even tested it on his servants. Naturally, he ordered one to be given a dose of poison, followed by a bezoar. The servant died, but Charles still kept the stone. He probably told himself the man didn't drink it properly. And really, that sums up the royal approach to medicine. If it didn't work, you were just doing it wrong. Now, let's drift softly into the world of gemstone medicine, the belief that crushed jewels could heal. This was especially popular among queens, who preferred their medicine to sparkle. Rubies were said to strengthen the heart, emeralds soothed the stomach, diamonds protected against plague and nightmares, and pearls, always pearls, were ground into milk and prescribed as elixirs of youth. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly took powdered pearls daily to maintain her royal complexion. Of course, pearls are made of calcium carbonate, which is not poisonous, but also not particularly useful. Still, it made her skin glow, perhaps from the sheer force of royal confidence. But my personal favorite gemstone remedy belongs to Catherine de Medici, the notorious Queen Mother of France. She adored emerald tonics. Her doctors dissolved them in vinegar and mixed them with honey, believing it would preserve her fertility. It did not, but it did give her expensive indigestion. Let's not forget leeches, the trusty companions of medieval physicians. They were so popular they practically became a symbol of medicine itself. Every ailment, from fevers to heartbreak, could allegedly be cured by removing a little blood. And if you were a king, that meant a lot of blood. Royal physicians believed their exalted patients possessed excess vitality that needed draining. In other words, you're special, so you need extra bleeding. Doctors kept leeches in ornate glass jars, feeding them with animal blood to keep them strong. Some even had favorite leeches, named them, pampered them, and occasionally refused to use them on anyone but the monarch. It was considered a great honor to have your leech chosen, less so to have it accidentally left on overnight. But not all remedies were quite so gory. Some were simply strange. Take unicorn horn. Europe was obsessed with it for centuries. Of course, no one had ever seen a unicorn, but merchants were happy to sell narwhal tusks as substitutes. Royal treasuries proudly displayed them. Doctors scraped bits off the tip, mixed them into drinks, and claimed they cured everything from poisoning to melancholy. The Danish royal family had a drinking cup made entirely from unicorn horn. They used it for ceremonial toasts, believing it would neutralize any toxin. Ironically, the cup was probably more valuable than the entire kingdom's medical knowledge. For pain relief, doctors turned to what we now recognize as opiates, though they didn't quite grasp how dangerous they were. They called it laudanum, a mixture of alcohol, herbs, and opium. It was sweet, potent, and very addictive. Queen Victoria famously used it for menstrual cramps, and it worked so well that she reportedly requested it monthly for decades. Earlier monarchs used even stronger versions. The French kings had opium syrup flavored with gold leaf, because nothing says luxury like narcotics sprinkled with precious metal. By the 17th century, royal doctors had discovered something that genuinely worked, but naturally, they used it to excess. Many noble households had at least one laudanum addict quietly nodding off during dinner. Then there were the beauty treatments, which were a kind of medical theater on their own, because royal doctors didn't just heal, they preserved appearances. Queen Elizabeth I again offers a tragicomic example. She used a face paint called Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar. It gave her that famous pale, porcelain complexion, but it also destroyed her skin over time, leading to sores that she then covered with even more ceruse. Her doctors watched quietly, applying balms made from honey and mercury, which didn't help. By the end of her life, she refused to be seen without makeup. Her mask of youth, as it was called, had become literal. Royal doctors also had to manage pregnancy and fertility, two of the most politically important medical conditions imaginable. A barren queen could cause dynastic collapse, so her body became a national concern. Treatments ranged from bizarre to outright dangerous. Women were told to eat roasted dove hearts, drink potions made of rabbit blood, or sleep with pieces of coral under their pillows. One French queen was advised to bathe in the milk of 40 donkeys a day, which she dutifully did, probably while wondering why her life smelled like a cheese market. Royal physicians insisted these remedies worked, of course, because telling a queen she might just be infertile was not a career-enhancing move. And when the babies finally arrived, royal doctors didn't stop experimenting. They recommended swaddling infants so tightly they could barely move to make them graceful. They rubbed honey on gums for teething, which, at least, sounds pleasant. And they sometimes gave infants small doses of opium to help them sleep. It worked too well. You can imagine the quiet horror that must have crept through the palace when a royal nursery went too quiet. But again, no one blamed the doctor, because the doctor was always acting in accordance with the art. poison, naturally, was the shadow that haunted every royal apothecary. And so, physicians doubled as poison experts, part healer, part detective. When a king fell ill suddenly, everyone turned to the doctor and asked, was it natural? Which was an impossible question, since natural medicine at the time already looked like witchcraft. They'd test food by feeding it to dogs, birds, or the occasional unfortunate servant. If the animal survived, the meal was safe. If not, well, too late for dinner. Some doctors specialized in counter poisons. They mixed antidotes, using everything from crushed emeralds to dried vipers. The most famous of these concoctions was theriac, a kind of universal antidote with over 60 ingredients, including opium, cinnamon, myrrh, and snake flesh. It took months to prepare, and kings swore by it. Nero kept it by his bedside, so did later emperors, popes, and anyone else with enough enemies to justify daily snake smoothies. Did it work? Probably not, but it did smell impressive. Royal physicians also indulged in astrological medicine. They timed treatments based on the alignment of the planets. If Mars was ascendant, you avoided surgery. If the moon was waning, you bled less, because apparently the cosmos cared deeply about your phlegm balance. King Henry VII of England kept a zodiac man chart in his private chambers, a diagram of the human body overlaid with constellations. It told you which body parts were ruled by which planets. The head was Aries, the stomach was Cancer, the knees were Capricorn, and so on. Doctors used it like a cosmic map for treatment schedules. If your liver hurt when Sagittarius was in retrograde, tough luck. That was the wrong week for remedies. As absurd as all this sounds, it's worth remembering that these doctors were doing their best with what they had. They lived in a world before germs, before anesthesia, before even basic hygiene. A world where washing hands wasn't medicine, it was superstition. And yet, somehow, through all the mummified powder and mercury tonics, tiny glimpses of progress began to shine through. They learned that certain herbs eased pain, that clean air mattered, that some wounds healed better when left alone. The irony is that much of that wisdom came not from the royal physicians, but from their assistants, the humble herbalists, apothecaries, and nurses who quietly observed what actually worked. The royals got the prestige, the servants got the insight. So, next time you sip some herbal tea or take a vitamin, think of the royal doctors, strutting through candlelit halls, clutching their gold-handled scalpels and jars of leeches, pretending they understood the mysteries of the human body. They didn't, not really, but they looked like they did. And in a world obsessed with appearances, that was enough, because medicine, for centuries, wasn't about healing the body, it was about reassuring the crown. End of part 2. Part 3. The royal obsession with immortality. Hey everyone, if you're still gently awake, well done. Tonight, we drift into a quieter kind of folly, the royal obsession with living forever. Because, naturally, when you have entire kingdoms depending on your continued existence, dying isn't exactly convenient, and so began centuries of aristocratic experiments in longevity, ranging from mildly charming to profoundly absurd. Kings and queens wanted immortality, or at least the appearance of it. They believed that if they could outlast everyone else, both their power and their dignity would remain unquestioned. So they turned to diets, alchemy, elixirs, cosmetics, and sometimes outright magic, all under the watchful gaze of their loyal and often terrified court physicians. Let's begin with alchemical elixirs. Because what could go wrong when you give someone powdered gold and mercury and tell them it will make them eternal? Emperor Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire, a man whose court resembled a cross between a medieval laboratory and a curiosity cabinet, was obsessed with alchemy. He employed dozens of alchemists, not just for profit or prestige, but because he genuinely wanted to live forever. They brewed tinctures and distilled substances from precious metals, rare minerals, and exotic herbs. He drank their experiments daily, often with the satisfaction of someone enjoying a very expensive, slightly metallic tonic, and he was, as you might expect, a little unwell. Rudolph had a notoriously pale, puffy complexion, and historians now suspect chronic mercury poisoning. But he persisted because, to be fair, if you're a Holy Roman Emperor, the idea that your court might be wrong about immortality is unthinkable. Meanwhile, in France, Catherine de Medici also dabbled in longevity potions. She famously imported apothecaries from Italy who specialized in elixirs that promised eternal youth. One of her favorite remedies involved drinking roses steeped in gold leaf, because apparently youth is best achieved one petal and one shiny coin at a time. She also experimented with bloodletting for immortality. This might sound like a contradiction, but the reasoning was simple. By purging the body of impure humors, you would theoretically remain vital forever. Of course, frequent bleeding often left her weaker and more susceptible to illness, but at least her skin looked slightly more alabaster. Meanwhile, across the channel, Queen Elizabeth I quietly pursued her own version of immortality. She was famously obsessed with maintaining her youthful appearance. Her makeup routine, layers of lead-based ceruse, gave her the signature pale, glowing visage. Each application was a delicate balancing act, enough to cover imperfections, but not so much that the weight of accumulated lead would collapse her features entirely. Elizabeth also engaged in a strict regimen of perfumed powders and herbal baths. She believed that cleanliness, fragrance, and pale skin were all interconnected with longevity. The logic made sense at the time. Disease came from filth. Filth came from decay. Decay led to death. Therefore, scented pale skin equals life everlasting. It did not, unfortunately, prevent the end of her reign. And then there was Tsar Peter the Great of Russia, who had an entirely different approach. Peter was obsessed with modernization, and for him, longevity meant discipline. He imposed rigorous exercise routines, daily inspections, cold water plunges, and regulated diets on himself and his court. He believed that physical vigor could stave off the decay of age, which makes sense if your definition of decay is sitting around drinking vodka all day. In practice, it mostly meant exhausted nobles and the occasional frostbite incident. Alchemical and cosmetic remedies weren't the only routes to perceived immortality. Dietary experimentation played a surprisingly large role. In medieval courts, kings were advised to consume rare or expensive foods believed to extend life. For instance, swan, peacock, and nightingale were considered restorative. You could eat the birds themselves or consume distilled essences of their organs, which was popular among alchemists who wanted to infuse meals with life force. One particularly unlucky courtier accidentally mistook a dish of powdered swan's heart for dessert. He survived. The king was unimpressed. Some monarchs also experimented with extreme fasting or selective diets. Charles V of Spain, for example, was advised by his doctors to consume nothing but light broths and vegetables for weeks at a time. They believed that avoiding rich foods would prevent the humors from becoming imbalanced and slow the decay of the body. He ended up gaunt, perpetually cold, and remarkably cranky, which, considering the context, is probably the closest he got to feeling immortal. Then there were the physical interventions, often involving exercise or unusual therapies. King Louis XIV of France, for instance, was convinced that regular bathing in warm water would preserve vitality. Naturally, this required elaborate baths lined with fragrant herbs, perfumed oils, and attendants to manage the process. He spent hours in these baths, convinced each soak was buying him extra years. By modern accounts, he probably just acquired mild, pruny skin and a strong appreciation for scented water. Meanwhile, King Henry IV of France relied on a combination of heavy drinking and opiates, believing that indulgence in pleasures preserved life through the joy it brought. The record suggests it might have preserved nothing except hangovers. One cannot discuss royal longevity without mentioning the obsession with virginity and sexual restraint. Many monarchs believed that abstaining from sexual activity, or regulating it extremely carefully, could prolong life. This belief was particularly popular in the 16th and 17th centuries, influenced by both humoral theory and religious morality. Queen Anne of Denmark, for example, reportedly limited her sexual interaction strictly to conception periods. The court whispered that she was saving her life force, as one might save a rare bottle of wine. Historians now agree it probably just increased tension in the palace and produced very anxious heirs. Meanwhile, across Europe, some rulers embraced eccentric daily rituals. Peter the Great famously required that he and his courtiers attend public walks in the freezing snow, insisting that exposure to cold strengthened their constitutions. Louis XIV insisted on elaborate morning routines, stretching, massaging, and occasionally being carried through the halls to maintain spinal integrity. Charles I of England, on the other hand, believed that staring at paintings of noble ancestors while sipping herbal teas extended the wisdom and vitality of his bloodline into his own body. All of these were, in their own quiet way, attempts at immortality, not through science, not through reason, but through ritualized, carefully observed practice. One of the most famous, if tragically misguided, longevity pursuits was the quest for the philosopher's stone. This alchemical obsession gripped almost every European court between the 14th and 17th centuries. It was said to have two main powers: the transmutation of base metals into gold, and the grant of eternal life. King James I of England invested heavily in alchemists who promised this miraculous substance. They produced powders, elixirs, and elaborate diagrams filled with stars, lions, and strange symbols. The king drank the mixtures, rubbed them onto his skin, and occasionally inhaled vapors, none of which seemed to have extended his life. He died at 58, but at least he died slightly sparkly, which is more than most alchemists could achieve for themselves. Even in death, some monarchs sought posthumous immortality. They ordered elaborate tombs, mummification, and carefully controlled funerary rituals. The goal was simple: the body should endure so that the royal essence might linger, visible to posterity. Henry VII of England, for instance, was buried in a marble tomb lined with lead. His advisors hoped this would preserve him as both a symbol and a deterrent against forgetting the Tudor legacy. It worked for centuries, or at least until the occasional ambitious nephew came along. As time went on, the methods became somewhat less magical and more scientifically oriented. If you call bloodletting and opium scientific, by the 18th century, European monarchs were combining careful diet, hygiene, exercise, and early medical observation. Some even began maintaining detailed health records. But the obsession with eternal life never truly disappeared. Napoleon Bonaparte, for example, was famously meticulous about diet, exercise, and clean living, convinced that careful management of the body could prevent premature death. He was right to an extent. He lived to 51, which is long for a soldier constantly on campaign, but sadly, not eternal. It's worth noting that the desire for immortality was not limited to kings and queens. Princes, princesses, and even minor nobility often adopted these practices. Courtiers followed royal rituals, wore powdered wigs, consumed opiates, and obsessed over gem elixirs. It became a form of social conformity, where longevity was a mark of refinement, wisdom, and divine favor. And, as always, the true beneficiaries were the physicians, apothecaries, and alchemists who sold these treatments. They accumulated wealth, status, and occasionally noble gratitude until the inevitable death rendered all claims of immortality moot. In retrospect, the royal obsession with immortality was both tragic and gently absurd. Kings and queens pursued it with sincerity, investment, and ceremony. They consumed poisons, inhaled metals, bathed in perfumed waters, drank crushed pearls, and endured tedious physical regimens, all in the quiet hope that their reigns could extend beyond mortality itself. And yet, somehow, that striving tells us something comforting. Even the most powerful humans, with armies, crowns, and kingdoms at their command, were just as anxious about the passage of time as anyone else. They wanted to linger, to remain, to be admired, and they were willing to be a little ridiculous in the process. So as you drift closer to sleep, imagine these monarchs in their candlelit chambers, sipping mercury-laced elixirs, drinking pearl powders, practicing breathing exercises in the snow, frowning slightly at the prospect of decay. And remember, for all their splendor, all their ceremonies, and all their exotic treatments, they were just people, fragile, mortal, and quietly desperate to make the hours last a little longer. Because in the end, immortality was always more of an idea than a reality, and perhaps that's why we find it so gently amusing today. End of Part 3. Part 4. The Pettiest Royal Quarrels and Courtly Rivalries. Hey everyone, if you're still with me, that's impressive. Or perhaps you're just perfectly attuned to the soothing cadence of historical absurdity. Tonight, we drift into a quieter, oddly satisfying type of chaos. The pettiest royal quarrels and courtly rivalries, because of course, in a world where everyone's status depends on proximity to power, small annoyances could metastasize into decades-long grudges. And naturally, these feuds were usually between people with extravagant gowns, powdered wigs, and more leisure time than sense. Let's begin with Louis XIV of France, a king famous not just for his sun-like presence, but also for his astonishingly long attention to small slights. He reportedly maintained a running mental tally of which courtiers looked at him with insufficient awe. He noticed every misplaced bow, every whispered giggle, every misaligned shoe. This wasn't paranoia. He simply had too much time and an inexhaustible supply of mirrors. One famous feud involved a minor noblewoman who dared to wear slightly less embroidery than was considered acceptable at court. Louis, in his infinite grace, noticed. He withdrew his patronage quietly, but systematically. For years, her career languished. Her only solace, historians speculate, was that she was exceptionally skilled at sighing discreetly. Meanwhile, England's royal court offered a more theatrical form of pettiness. Queen Elizabeth I's ladies-in-waiting were a hotbed of rivalry. They competed over dresses, jewels, and who could deliver the most pointed curtsies. One particularly long-running dispute arose between two maids over the placement of a lace collar. Elizabeth, observing in her pale, lead-painted perfection, quietly amused herself. Occasionally, she would shift the collar of one maid ever so slightly, just to provoke a tiny scandal. Across Europe, marriage arrangements provided endless fuel for courtly quarrels. Princes and princesses were paired not by love, but by strategy. The result? Months, years, sometimes decades of simmering resentment. Take the case of Charles I of England and Henrietta Maria of France. Charles, a man more interested in pious reflection and occasional hunting, found his French queen a tad too energetic for his taste. Henrietta Maria, in turn, was unimpressed by his frequent melancholy. Court factions immediately formed around small preferences: who preferred French wines, who enjoyed English dances, who dared to smile at the wrong person. These subtle divisions escalated into almost comical political alignments, and yet they influenced the very course of history. Now, consider Peter the Great of Russia. He was famously tall, imposing, and inclined toward extreme measures, but he had his own share of domestic and courtly pettiness. One nobleman angered Peter by failing to polish his boots to the exact specified sheen. Peter, never one to waste a grudge, imposed a month-long ban on his attendance at court festivities. The nobleman survived, but the story spread, earning Peter a reputation as both intimidating and amusingly meticulous. Even smaller, seemingly trivial matters could trigger legendary disputes. Louis XIV once barred an entire household of minor nobles from court simply because one of their cats wandered into the hall. The incident was recorded by multiple courtiers, who clearly had nothing better to do, and the court, naturally, survived, though slightly more cautious about feline ingress. Feuds weren't always so subtle. In the Holy Roman Empire, Emperor Ferdinand II demonstrated the slightly more extreme version of petty rivalry. He and a local prince quarreled over seating arrangements at a banquet. A minor misalignment of chairs, 1 inch, perhaps, was considered an affront to imperial dignity. Ferdinand demanded apologies. Letters were exchanged, and historians now treat the episode as both tragic and oddly soothing, because it reminds us that even emperors could be irritated by something as mundane as furniture placement. Meanwhile, in Italy, the Medici family exhibited their own brand of slow-burn grudges. Florentine nobles held elaborate, multi-year rivalries over access to palaces, commission orders for artwork, and the subtle art of looking disdainfully at someone else's fresco. The disputes were conducted quietly, a narrowed eyebrow here, a slight turn of the head there, but they could have consequences for marriages, trade, and occasionally, minor executions. It was political theater, performed in whispers and silk. Let's drift over to Scotland, where court quarrels often blended with personal idiosyncrasy. James VI, later James I of England, had a habit of writing letters of reprimand to courtiers for minor slights. One letter scolded a nobleman for laughing too loudly at a dinner. Another warned that a lady's wimple was distastefully askew. The tone was polite but icy. The result was decades of tense politeness punctuated by bursts of exaggerated courtesy. Even more charmingly, some courtiers retaliated with subtle sabotage. They mislaid ceremonial gloves, whispered slightly misleading gossip, or painted themselves as more dutiful than they actually were. All of this to curry favor with monarchs who were equally distracted by the tiniest indignities. Elizabethan England also excelled at the fine art of rivalry. The two great courtiers, Robert Dudley and William Cecil, each had their own loyal factions. They competed over influence, access, and the Queen's attention. Sometimes it was as simple as who received the first cup of tea, though tea itself was rare. Other times it involved elaborate, multi-step maneuvers, sabotaged letters, exaggerated compliments, subtle insinuations in the Queen's presence, and naturally, every minor move could ripple into a full-blown court scandal. Across the Channel, French aristocrats competed over even the smallest symbols of prestige. Consider hair. Wigs were elaborate, sometimes heavy, sometimes dangerously tall. Minor misalignments could spark whispers. A slightly crooked curl could be the subject of weeks of gossip, and naturally, the offended party would respond in kind, ensuring that the feud continued. Perfume was another battlefield. At Versailles, some courtiers would subtly increase their scent, ensuring that their rivals smelled faintly unpleasant in comparison. A whiff of lavender here, a dash of amber there, and suddenly, social advantage had shifted. The battles were invisible to outsiders, but fatal to self-esteem. Of course, petty rivalries weren't confined to appearance or fragrance. Food, seating, music, and even the choice of dance partner could provoke long-term tension. At balls, nobles would observe the order of entrance, the size of the slice of pie they received, and whether the king or queen smiled in their direction. Small slights became symbolic of larger political and familial disputes. Courtiers developed mental maps of these hierarchies and maneuvered carefully, often taking years to fully settle grudges. Some of the most interesting disputes involved royal siblings. Charles II of Spain, notoriously inbred and physically fragile, was raised alongside numerous cousins and siblings who constantly competed for his attention. Every whispered compliment, every shared dessert, every minor chore became a contest. By adulthood, Charles' court was a carefully orchestrated network of grudges and alliances, a situation he probably found mildly exhausting, and yet, to him, it must have seemed entirely normal. Even minor siblings could hold influence long after leaving the main stage. Letters, gifts, and carefully curated absences ensured that no slight went unnoticed. Courtiers would record these interactions, later consulting the scoreboard of petty victories and defeats. Let's drift over to Sweden, where courtly quarrels were often seasonal. During summer outings, nobles would argue over the placement of pavilions, the arrangement of flowers, and the precise moment to unveil statues. A poorly timed reveal could result in a diplomatic insult. These disagreements were subtle, often resolved through carefully worded apologies and minor rearrangements. Historians note that these disputes were remarkably effective at maintaining a sense of hierarchy and keeping everyone slightly on edge. Meanwhile, in Poland, the royal court often quarreled over hunting rights. Nobles would argue over access to specific forests, which animals were permissible to hunt, and the proper etiquette for presenting a kill to the monarch. Disputes could last weeks, involve multiple witnesses, and sometimes escalate to duels, which, fortunately, were usually formal and uninjurious. The result was a society perpetually tense, mildly irritated, and thoroughly polite. Even minor ceremonial errors could provoke long-term rivalries. Consider a footman who tripped while presenting the king's shoes, or a court musician who played slightly too loudly during a dance. These small mistakes were recorded in diaries, discussed in whispers, and occasionally memorialized in official reprimands. Over time, The accumulation of such slights could define relationships between entire branches of nobility. Petty quarrels often intertwined with financial disputes. Nobles competed for gifts, land, and allowances. Failure to receive a purse of gold or a share of a dowry could generate lingering resentment. Letters of complaint circulated, delicate insults were drafted, and networks of influence worked quietly to correct perceived injustices. The resulting tension was invisible to the outside world but profoundly effective in structuring daily life at court. And then there were the fashion wars. Courtiers monitored each other's attire meticulously. One gown too extravagant, one ribbon slightly off color, one wig taller than etiquette allowed. All became potential sources of dispute. Sometimes the monarch intervened, issuing gentle corrections or stern reminders. Other times, the feud simmered quietly, like a pot left on the stove. Years later, historians would note the subtle shifts in court fashion and attribute them to these ongoing rivalries. The most fascinating aspect of all this is the persistence of grudges. Monarchs and nobles remembered slights decades after the fact. Courtiers would inherit resentments from their parents, continuing disputes that had begun long before their birth. Marriages, alliances, and ceremonial events were carefully orchestrated to maintain or exploit these tensions. And yet, through all this, society continued, slightly tense, slightly absurd, but undeniably human. Even in quieter courts, gossip acted as both a weapon and a balm. A whispered rumor about a misplaced letter or an overlooked gift could fuel months of subtle maneuvering. At the same time, it allowed courtiers to bond over shared indignation, providing a strangely comforting social rhythm. So, as you drift closer to sleep, imagine these scenes: courtiers measuring ribbons, adjusting collars, and frowning at slightly tilted lace. Kings noting the angle of bows, the scent of perfumes, and the exact sequence of dances. Princesses exchanging discreet glances over teacups, plotting minor victories, and every so often, a servant quietly noting the whole affair, recording it for posterity or personal amusement. All of this was quiet, meticulous, and absurdly human, because at the end of the day, power is as much about perception as reality, and perception, in these courts, was measured in inches of lace, glimmers of jewelry, and tiny, interminable slights. Petty quarrels and courtly rivalries, gentle listeners, were not merely trivialities. They structured social life, reinforced hierarchy, and occupied minds in a way that allowed monarchs to sleep, reign, and occasionally overindulge in elixirs. And yet, to us today, these slow, carefully orchestrated disputes are a comforting reminder. Even the most powerful humans could be distracted by something as small as a crooked ribbon, because, after all, if a king can frown over lace for decades, we can surely allow ourselves to be lulled into a quiet, reflective sleep. End of Part 4. Part 5. Royal Children and Their Fragile, Peculiar Lives. Hate everyone. If you've made it this far, congratulations. Or perhaps it's simply the calming cadence of history that keeps you anchored. Tonight, we drift softly into the quieter, often melancholy world of royal children. Because, of course, even the tiniest future monarchs had lives filled with absurd expectations, strange habits, and remarkably fragile routines. And naturally, the combination of power, lineage, and delicate constitution made their early years simultaneously fascinating and quietly unsettling. Let's begin with Charles II of Spain, often described by historians with a gentle sigh and a sense of exasperation. He was nicknamed the Bewitched which sounds dramatic, but in reality, it mostly reflected a combination of severe inbreeding, fragile health, and the occasional bout of mild confusion. Charles's early life was carefully managed, almost excessively so, by a staff of nurses, wet nurses, tutors, and physicians, each attempting to mold a sickly boy into a sovereign capable of ruling an empire. He was surrounded by silk, velvet, and powdered attendants, yet every sneeze, cough, or awkward smile was catalogued as a matter of dynastic concern. Royal children, you see, were never simply children. They were vessels of national hope, fragile dynastic instruments, and, on occasion, miniature tragicomedies. Their cribs were elaborate, often resembling small thrones rather than beds. Linens were frequently perfumed and changed with a care bordering on obsession. Even the wet nurses were selected with the precision of a military campaign. The wrong choice could be catastrophic, at least in the eyes of anxious parents. Take Louis XIV, another example of a childhood carefully sculpted, if not entirely enjoyable. He was sent to a tutor at a young age who emphasized etiquette, religious instruction, and the precise positioning of hands during prayer. Louis's days were regimented, meals at exact hours, naps at designated moments, and periods of reflection in front of mirrors to practice posture. Playtime, such as it was, consisted of miniature military exercises with wooden swords and toy cannons, undoubtedly satisfying for a boy who would one day command entire armies, but slightly peculiar for a 5-year-old. And naturally, his health was a constant concern. A cough, a fever, or even a slight pallor prompted whispered consultations among physicians who often disagreed, quietly sending each other coded messages through letters. In England, Henry VII's children were subject to similar regimes. Edward VI, his only legitimate son by Jane Seymour, spent the early years of his life under the careful supervision of multiple tutors, nurses, and attendants. Edward's education was extraordinary for the time: Latin, Greek, and theology, but so rigorous that historians speculate he may have spent more time reciting than breathing. Illnesses were a constant threat. Simple colds could spiral into dangerous complications, because the combination of high expectation and fragile constitution rarely allowed for simple childhood care. Royal children were also peculiar in their daily routines. Hygiene was a matter of ritual, not comfort. A child might be washed using cloths dipped in wine, vinegar, or herbal infusions. Bathing in the modern sense was rare, and when it occurred, attendants closely monitored temperature, timing, and the sequence of drying. Royal skin, naturally, became a delicacy in its own right, lightly perfumed, meticulously managed, and occasionally a source of anxiety when a rash or minor blemish appeared. Food was another complicated affair. Children were fed according to strict schedules, with meals chosen both for nutrition and symbolic resonance. Soups, broths, and delicately prepared meats were common. Sugar, emerging as a luxury ingredient, was cautiously rationed. A royal child indulging too much could be scolded not only for health, but for propriety. And naturally, each bite was often overseen by a combination of governesses, nurses, and court physicians, a small army surrounding a single tray of food. Let's drift over to Marie Antoinette's children, whose upbringing was similarly regimented. The French queen insisted upon structure, education, and decorum, yet the children were often left in the hands of carefully chosen governesses and nurses. The young Dauphin and his siblings experienced the combination of lavish surroundings and emotionally distant supervision. Games were permitted, but always with a subtle focus on politeness, coordination, and obedience. A misstep in a dance, a crooked bow, or a poorly recited lesson could provoke quiet disappointment, which, to a child, was tantamount to catastrophe. Fragility of health was a constant companion. Even minor illnesses demanded attention, often turning small colds into exercises in collective anxiety. Doctors, appointed for life or seasonally, debated remedies, bleeding, herbal poultices, or the occasional tonic. Parents fretted, courtiers whispered, wit nurses nodded, perfumed and vigilant. Every sneeze was a potential political crisis. Every fever a matter of dynastic import. In Russia, royal children were sometimes both privileged and perilously exposed. Peter the Great's offspring were raised amidst instruction in statecraft, military drills, and foreign languages. At the same time, they were expected to endure extreme cold, long walks, and strict schedules. Failure to adhere to the regimen might result in private lectures, sometimes delivered with a subtle edge of terror. The combination of high expectations and fragile health created a generation of children both precocious and quietly burdened. Odd habits were common. Young monarchs often developed routines to cope with the tedium of instruction. Charles II of Spain reportedly took to chewing on his sleeve when nervous. Louis XIV practiced curts to mirrors late into the night. Marie Antoinette's children traced imaginary maps on the floor with tiny sticks, mimicking military campaigns they would never lead. These habits were harmless, yet deeply revealing, glimpses into the minds of children confined by duty and expectation. Royal meltdowns, gentle listener, were also a feature of courtly life. A tantrum might be provoked by a misplaced toy, a forgotten lesson, or an overly strict tutor. Yet even these eruptions were observed quietly, catalogued by attendants, and occasionally reported to the monarch. The child's suffering was tempered by ceremony. A cry could be met with a discreet handkerchief or a soft lullaby, but never a breach of protocol. The tension between personal expression and public expectation was constant, a soft, simmering background noise in the lives of the privileged and fragile. Education, as you might imagine, was meticulously designed. Literacy, numeracy, and languages were prioritized above leisure. Games were often educational in disguise. Chess, for example, was encouraged not merely for amusement, but as preparation for military strategy. Recitation of poetry, scripture, and historical events was drilled until performance became nearly automatic. And naturally, mistakes were gently noted, the severity calibrated to impress, instruct, and sometimes amuse the supervising adults. Even sleep, the most private of needs, was structured. Royal children had carefully timed naps and bedtime rituals. Attendants monitored temperature, bedding, and positioning. In some cases, prayers were recited aloud, songs were hummed softly, and the child was carefully tucked in with scented linens. Sleep itself was a performance of sorts, a carefully regulated act within the larger theater of courtly upbringing. Travel, gentle listener, added another layer of strain. Royal children were frequently transported for diplomatic reasons, marriages, or health concerns. Carriages were padded, attendants surrounded the young passengers, and schedules were regimented to the hour. Yet motion sickness, exposure, and exhaustion were constant companions. Courtiers would whisper remedies, nurses would quietly fuss, and the child would endure with a blend of resignation and bewildered curiosity. Petty rivalries even emerged among siblings. Attention from parents, preferred tutors, and favored gifts all became grounds for subtle resentment. Children learned early to navigate these tensions. One might excel in lessons to earn praise. Another might feign illness to attract sympathy. These dynamics shaped character, often producing adults who were both astute and slightly wary, a perfect combination for navigating courts riddled with intrigue. Consider the story of Edward VI, whose early exposure to both rigorous education and political turmoil left him precocious but fragile. Illnesses compounded by the weight of expectation made daily life precarious. He was subject to constant observation, from tutors and physicians to courtiers eager to interpret every sneeze, cough, or expression. Even minor incidents, a slight mispronunciation, a poorly executed posture, could provoke disproportionate concern. Yet amidst these pressures, Edward demonstrated intelligence, curiosity, and, remarkably, patience, qualities historians admire softly, without exuberance. Royal childhoods were also shaped by ceremonial events, christenings, miniature processions, and courtly lessons were performed as public spectacles, often inside grand halls. Even play was partially ceremonial. Children learned to move gracefully, speak clearly, and interact politely with adults who were sometimes both intimidating and perfumed. Failure to conform could result in quiet admonishment, whispers, or a subtle shift in seating arrangements at the next event. Even the most trivial items became symbols of preference or disfavor. A favorite doll, a gifted horse, or a treasured book could mark the recipient as particularly valued. Conversely, the absence of such attention could foster subtle resentment or mild despair. Attendants often mediated these minor crises, attempting to maintain balance while navigating the complex web of parental expectations and sibling competition. Health crises, naturally, were magnified by circumstance. Smallpox, measles, and other illnesses threatened both life and dynastic continuity. Doctors debated remedies, often experimenting with bleeding, poultices, or herbal treatments. Parents fretted, courtiers whispered, and the children endured a delicate combination of care and concern. Every recovery was noted in diaries, every relapse cataloged for posterity. Even minor accomplishments were measured against enormous expectations. A first step, a first word, or a first reading lesson became events of significance. Attendants recorded these milestones, often in painstaking detail. The child, meanwhile, experienced life largely as a series of gentle nudges, observations, and soft corrections, occasionally punctuated by indulgent affection. To drift toward a final thought for tonight, consider the peculiar blend of privilege, fragility, and the expectation that defined royal childhoods. Children were adored and constrained in equal measure, raised to embody national hope while navigating the quiet absurdities of courtly life. Their days were regimented, their routines precise, their illnesses carefully monitored, and their play subtly educational. Yet amidst this delicate orchestration, laughter, curiosity, and small acts of rebellion inevitably emerged, fleeting glimpses of humanity beneath layers of velvet, lace, and expectation. Even the most fragile monarchs eventually grew into their roles, carrying the early lessons of meticulous observation, subtle rivalry, and carefully structured routines into adulthood. And for us, gentle listener, these stories provide a soft, slightly sardonic lullaby. The fragile, peculiar lives of children whose fate shaped nations, yet who often struggled with the simplest pleasures of childhood. Because, after all, if a child born to empire can endure daily baths in wine-scented cloths, meticulously arranged toys, and constant scrutiny, we can surely allow ourselves to drift gently into sleep, carried by the quiet absurdity of history. Good night.